Welcome to Midnight Casebook, where every shadow hides a secret and every mystery begs to be solved. Tonight, we unravel the chilling tale of Father Brown, and She Smiled Before the Murder, a fan-made story paying homage to the brilliance of G.K., Chesterton's legendary detective. We'd love to have you along for this enigmatic journey. Drop a comment to let us know where you're watching from. Share your theories, and if you spot any inconsistencies, don't hesitate to call them out. Your keen eyes and sharp minds help us craft even more captivating mysteries in the future. Chapter 1. She Smiled Before the Murder. She was smiling when the knife went in. Not the kind of smile you forget. No, it was something chilling, serene, as though she already knew what was coming and welcomed it. The kind of smile that doesn't belong on a person moments before death, unless they're hiding something far worse than murder. The rain had been falling for hours on Kembleford that afternoon. It tapped like bony fingers against the stained glass windows of St. Mary's Church, as if the heavens themselves were trying to knock and warn them all. The wedding was supposed to be a joyful one. Margaret Donnelly, the young schoolteacher, finally marrying Alan Beresford, the wealthy banker's son. The church was filled with white lilies, the scent heavy, sickly, almost funerary. Everyone said Margaret looked radiant, but Father Brown, he saw something different, something no one else did. She didn't look at Alan when she walked down the aisle. She looked at the back row, and she smiled. It was fleeting, gone in a blink, but it chilled Father Brown's soul. A smile that knew too much, a smile that wasn't meant for a groom at all. Before nightfall, she would be found dead in the vestry, stabbed once, precisely between the ribs. No sign of a struggle, no blood trail, just her body, a faint smile still resting on her lips. And yet, no one heard a scream. Kembleford is not a place where people go missing unnoticed, let alone murdered in plain sight. The entire village reeled with gossip and disbelief. How could such a thing happen? In a church, on a wedding day, under Father Brown's own roof. But Father Brown remained unnervingly quiet. He stood alone in the vestry, long after the constables had come and gone, studying the empty room as though it were shouting secrets he couldn't yet hear. He ran his fingers along the carved wood of the prayer bench, paused by the wall of ancient hymnals. Then, with great hesitation, he turned toward the stained glass window, where hours earlier Margaret had glanced and smiled. The coroner's report was uneventful. Single wound, clean, no hesitation, no signs of defensive injury, not suicide. The knife, missing. Time of death, between 3:15 and 3:45 p.m., right when the wedding ceremony had reached its peak and all eyes were on the altar. Except hers. The church had been locked, no sign of forced entry, dozens of people present, all accounted for. So how was she murdered? And more importantly, why was she smiling? By the next morning, a dark unease blanketed Kembleford like the fog that rolled off the moor. Speculation grew like mold in corners. Perhaps she had a secret lover, or an enemy in the family, or even a past she hadn't fully escaped. Alan, the groom, claimed to be devastated, but didn't shed a tear. Margaret's sister, Beatrice, seemed oddly relieved, as if a long-awaited burden had been lifted. And Father Brown, he listened, he watched, he waited. There was something very wrong, he thought, about the silence of it all, the quietness of the death. It wasn't merely the absence of sound, it was the stillness in the way people spoke of her, as if they feared speaking too much. She was not what she seemed. whispered Mrs. Collins, the church's organist, to Father Brown that evening. "You know that, don't you?" Father Brown didn't respond. Instead, he walked back to the vestry, alone. Midnight, rain falling harder now. A single candle lit the room, and there, in the corner, something flickered. Not the candlelight. A memory. A sound. No, an absence of sound. He dropped to his knees and pulled back the rug. A trapdoor. Ancient. Rusted. Forgotten. It creaked open slowly. Darkness below. The passage to the old priest's tunnels, sealed for decades. Supposedly, dust stirred as he climbed down. The smell of damp stone. Earth. Something rotten beneath holiness. His steps echoed. The tunnel led beneath the altar, then split into two directions. One ended in a bricked wall. The other opened into a small, circular chamber, lined with rotting wooden pews and old liturgical books. And there, lying neatly on the floor, was the knife, wrapped in a cloth bearing the Donnelly family crest. Father Brown did not flinch, but he didn't pick it up either. Instead, he stared at the cloth and whispered a prayer, not for the dead, but for the living, because something was becoming terrifyingly clear. The murderer hadn't escaped. They had never left. He returned to the surface, silent. The next morning, Alan Beresford had already returned to his estate. Beatrice had vanished into the countryside, and Margaret's old diary had mysteriously disappeared from her apartment. That evening, the village gathered at the Red Fox pub. Eyes watched Father Brown enter, expecting answers. But he said nothing of the trapdoor, the knife, the cloth. He asked only one question. Who saw her smile first? No one responded, until a voice, low and bitter, cut through the silence. "I did," said Clara White, Margaret's childhood friend. She smiled at me. Everyone turned. Father Brown stepped forward. "When?" Clara's voice cracked. "Not at the church. The night before, she came to me, dripping wet. Her dress, torn. She said, 'I've done something terrible, Clara, but tomorrow it ends.' And then she smiled. Clara's hands trembled. She said she had a letter," Clara whispered. "A confession. She said she'd leave it in the Bible on the altar before the wedding began." "The Bible?" Father Brown's eyes narrowed. He left the pub without a word, heart pounding. Inside the church, the air was frozen. He approached the altar, slowly opened the pulpit's old family Bible. Nothing. No letter, just one page, torn out. Back in the vestry, he turned on the candle again. This time, he checked the inside of the candlestick base, unscrewed it. There it was, folded tightly, a single page of lined paper, torn from a diary. It read, "If they find this, I am already dead. But it must be known, I am not who they think. I took her place. She never made it back, and I could not live with the lie. I knew he would find me eventually. And if he kills me, tell Father Brown, check the window. He always knew." Father Brown's blood ran cold. "I took her place. Who? Who was she? The real Margaret? Or the imposter?" The villagers never heard what Father Brown discovered that night. But the next morning, the stained glass window Margaret had stared at was found shattered from the outside, as though someone had broken in, or broken out. No one reported the sound. No one saw a figure. But Father Brown did. A figure wrapped in a dark cloak, watching from the edge of the churchyard just before dawn, and then gone. He never told the constables what he read in that letter, never told them about the knife beneath the church or the missing diary. But when asked if the case was solved, he only said this: "Yes, I know who did it. But the truth will never be told. Because sometimes the smile comes before the murder, and sometimes it comes after." Chapter 2. Father Brown knew too much. They buried the wrong man, and Father Brown was the only one who knew it. The body in the coffin wore Peter Mallory's uniform, had his medal, even bore the same scar on his temple. But the moment the lid was opened for the village wake, Father Brown didn't look at the face. He looked at the hands, clean, smooth, no calluses, no bruises, and certainly no gunpowder burns. That corpse had never fired a weapon in its life. And Peter Mallory, Peter had been a marksman, a soldier, a man with dirt in his blood and secrets behind his eyes. So why was there a stranger in his place? It started 3 days before, when Peter supposedly fell into the river by the quarry bridge. No one saw him go in. No one heard a splash. Just a fisherman found his coat tangled in the reeds and footprints leading halfway down the muddy slope before disappearing altogether. They found the body 2 days later, a mile downstream, bloated and pale, face bloated beyond recognition. But his wallet was still in the coat, and the boots matched his size. Everyone said it had to be him. Everyone, except Father Brown. He didn't say a word at the wake, even as the widow wept, and the village doctor mumbled something about accidental drowning. But behind those quiet eyes, something had shifted, because Father Brown had seen something the others hadn't. Peter had come to confession 2 nights before he died, and what he confessed should never have been possible, unless someone else knew it too. That night, long after the candles were snuffed and the mourners had left the chapel, Father Brown stayed behind. He opened the vestry cupboard and pulled out the old confessional journal. Blank, as always, but folded inside its spine was a piece of paper Peter had slipped through the grill. One sentence: "If anything happens to me, it was never the river." No signature, no explanation, just that. And now, a corpse with the wrong hands was lying under sacred soil, blessed with holy rites, for a soul it didn't belong to. That alone would have been disturbing enough. But what happened next made Father Brown question everything. 2 nights later, Beatrice Mallory, Peter's younger sister, appeared in the church, shivering, barefoot, soaked to the bone. Her mouth trembled before her words did. "He's not dead," she whispered. "He sent me a letter." The paper she held was torn, crumpled, and stained with what looked like engine oil, but the handwriting, clear, deliberate. "Don't trust anyone, not even the priest." Father Brown read it twice, then a third time. And still, something inside him recoiled. The handwriting matched Peter's, but the voice, it didn't. He asked Beatrice who had delivered it. She said she found it tucked under her bedroom window, pinned with a nail that reeked of gasoline. The next morning, the local postmaster, Mr. Clevens, was found, unconscious behind his desk, a nasty gash on his head, and the parish register missing. No money taken, just the names of every man baptized in Kembleford in the last 40 years. Who would want that? Or more disturbingly, who would need it? Father Brown began to retrace Peter's steps. He visited the quarry. The muddy slope looked staged, the coat too neatly snagged. He found tire tracks, recent, wide, military, not from any village cart. At the base of the slope, something caught his I.A crushed cigarette stub, foreign brand, Russian. Peter Mallory had served in Berlin, post-war intelligence. He'd once told Father Brown that wars don't end, they just change uniforms, and suddenly it seemed the war had come home. By evening, Father Brown sat alone in the rectory, rereading the false note. Don't trust anyone, not even the priest. It wasn't a warning, it was a trap, designed to throw suspicion in a direction no one would dare question. And it worked, because that night, someone tried to burn down the rectory. They used petrol, broken windows, a trail of flames that lit up the church garden like the gates of hell. Father Brown escaped, barely, but something was left behind in the wreckage. A single bullet casing, wedged into the baseboard under his desk, engraved with the number 13. Only one man, Father Brown knew, ever numbered his bullets. Peter Mallory. So what was the message? A threat? A signature? Or a final riddle? Nothing made sense. Except for one terrifying possibility. Peter wasn't the victim. He was the architect. And this entire village was part of a design no one else could see. The next night, the church bells rang at midnight. No wind, no footsteps, no one pulling the rope, just sound, an echo, a warning. Father Brown entered the nave, candle in hand. On the altar was a single rose, dried, blackened at the edges, and a piece of cloth wrapped around its stem, military green. He opened it slowly. Inside was a photograph. Peter Mallory standing with 5 other soldiers, all smiling, all in uniform, and all, according to official records, dead, except Peter, and one other. Father Brown recognized the face immediately. Major Stanton, now retired, living in Kembleford. A quiet man with arthritis and a love of crossword puzzles, and apparently a very long memory. The next morning, Father Brown visited him. "Do you remember Berlin?" he asked. The major didn't blink, just looked up from his tea and said, "Some things you forget, others haunt you." Peter said something about a betrayal, Father Brown continued. He said someone changed sides. Major Stanton nodded slowly. "One of us took a file. Names, codes, agents who helped us stay alive. The file disappeared the night the wall fell. We thought Peter had it. We thought he sold it." "Did he?" The major didn't answer, but he smiled, and that smile chilled Father Brown more than fire ever could. That night, another note arrived. No envelope, just slipped under the church door. "If you open the crypt, you'll know why I had to vanish. But once you see it, you can't unsee it." The crypt had been sealed for 20 years. Father Brown broke the lock at dawn. The smell hit first. Dust, damp, death. He descended the steps slowly, every creak of the stone, like a groan from beneath the earth. At the far end, beneath the old bishop's tomb, was a satchel, military issue, marked with Mallory's initials. Inside, a file, stamped "Eyes Only," dated 1989, and beneath it, a rosary, not Peter's, Father Brown's. He had lost it 10 years ago in France. So how did it end up inside a crypt, next to a file no one was supposed to find, unless someone wanted him to, unless this entire mystery had been choreographed for him from the beginning? And suddenly, Father Brown realized something that froze his soul. The fire, the false letter, the numbered bullet, even the smile on the major's face. They weren't random. They were rehearsed. Someone was performing, not to hide the truth, but to reveal it, piece by piece, only to him. Not because they trusted him, because they needed a witness. The question was, to what? Because when he returned to the surface, the church was empty, and in the front pew sat another photograph, the same group of soldiers, except this time, one man was missing. Father Brown, the one taking the photo, he hadn't been part of it. He had been watching. The final note, scribbled on the back, said, "You knew too much, Father. Even back then. Now it's time you remember." And for the first time in years, Father Brown didn't feel like the investigator. He felt like the final piece in someone else's puzzle. And as he stood alone in the nave, wind rattling the stained glass, eyes fixed on the altar where it had all begun, he whispered to no one, "I know who did it. But the truth will never be told, because the dead man wasn't Peter. It never had been. And the war, it wasn't over. It had just changed uniforms, and this time it wore the collar of a priest." Chapter 3. Confession. Written in holy blood. The confessional was locked from the inside, but the priest was already dead. When they forced the wooden door open, it groaned like a dying man's breath. Inside, Father Mallory's body was slumped forward, arms crossed, head bowed like he was deep in prayer. But it wasn't prayer that painted the walls red. Blood soaked the carved panels, spattered across the ivory curtain like a sacred relic desecrated. And on the wall, smeared in that same blood, were 6 chilling words. "Forgive me, Father, for I lied." It wasn't just a murder. It was a message. Father Brown stood in silence at the edge of the nave, staring into the confessional as if it were a tomb someone had been buried alive in. There were no sounds, no murmurs from the villagers gathered behind him, just the steady ticking of the church's brass clock, each second louder than the last, as if time itself was watching in judgment. What disturbed Father Brown most wasn't the blood, or the body, or even the eerie stillness that clung to the walls like mildew. It was the candle. It was still burning, which meant whoever did it had stood inside that box with a dying priest, long enough to write on the wall, long enough to be calm, long enough to confess something, and then vanish. The constables came. The body was removed, the blood cleaned, at least from the public areas, but the words, they remained, faint, scrubbed, but not erased, as though the church itself refused to forget them. Father Mallory had been no ordinary man. Before taking his final vows, he had served as a war chaplain in France. A man with secrets, a man who heard more sins whispered in darkness than most men live through in their lifetimes. And he was the only person, other than Father Brown, who had access to the sealed confessional journal from 1947. The journal had vanished. No fingerprints on the candle, no footprints inside the confessional. But on the kneeler, tucked beneath the cushion, was a scrap of parchment, dried blood along the edges, and written in Latin, "The devil's mercy wears a cleric's smile." Father Brown recognized the handwriting instantly. It matched a note he had received 23 years earlier from a man who was supposed to have died in prison. Benedict Carlyle, the butcher of Belsford, a once defrocked priest who had confessed to 6 murders, 6 women, all of them found kneeling in prayer, all of them killed with a chalice knife. And now, his handwriting was back. That night, Father Brown sat in the rectory alone, the note on the table before him, candlelight trembling as if afraid to touch the ink. He remembered Carlyle's final confession, the way the man had leaned close through the grill and whispered, I only kill those God won't forgive. That same night, Carlyle vanished from the prison infirmary. They said he died during a fire. No body was ever recovered. Now, 23 years later, someone was mimicking his style. Or worse, he had returned. But that wasn't the part that made Father Brown's blood turn cold. It was what Father Mallory had whispered to him the day before he died. You were right. It wasn't just 6. The next morning, a woman named Lily Price was found unconscious in her cottage. No signs of forced entry, no bruises, but carved into her floorboards beside her bed in some dark tar-like substance were the same 6 words, "Forgive me, Father, for I lied." She couldn't speak. Her lips were stitched shut, literally, with black thread. Whoever had done this hadn't come to kill her. They had come to silence her. Father Brown visited Lily in the infirmary. Her eyes darted wildly when she saw him. She shook, tried to write something, but her fingers wouldn't stop trembling. Finally, she scrawled one word on the back of the bed tray, "Crypt," and then she began to cry. Later, that day, the church's oldest crypt was unsealed. Father Brown descended the stone steps with a single lantern, the air thick and damp, the walls lined with nameless graves too old for records. At the end of the hall, under the altar, he found something horrific. 7 small coffins, unmarked, stacked neatly like shelves, and on each one, carved with trembling strokes, were Roman numerals. Not in order, not evenly spaced, but the last one read 13. There was no logic to the E sequence until he remembered the journal, the one Father Mallory had kept, the one that vanished. Father Brown returned to the rectory and opened his own archives, pages from 30 years ago, hidden entries, and one name appeared over and over again: Eleanor Cross, a woman buried under a false name, a woman who had confessed years ago to witnessing a murder at St. Jude's Orphanage, run by Benedict Carlyle. A murder no one believed. She died weeks later in what was ruled an accident involving scalding water. But in her final confession, which Father Brown had kept secret even from the church, she wrote, "There were others." He used the confessional as his hunting ground. We thought it was safe. We thought it was holy. We were wrong. That was the missing piece. The confessional wasn't just where sins were forgiven, it was where they were selected. Later that week, a boy named Samuel, 9 years old, vanished after serving Mass. The sacristy door was left ajar. His shoes were neatly left on the 3rd step. In the sanctuary, scrawled in chalk behind the crucifix, "He listens through the curtains still." Panic consumed Kembleford. Rumors churned through the town like fog. People stopped attending Mass. Parents pulled their children from catechism. And through it all, Father Brown remained calm, observing, remembering, because he had seen this pattern once before. But this time, something was different. This time, someone was copying the killer, and they were doing it wrong. The original crimes had precision, ritual, a twisted theology. These, they were chaos, sloppy, and that meant one terrifying truth. There wasn't just one killer now. There were 2, the original and the imitator. Father Brown sat once again in the confessional, not to hear sins, but to listen for breathing, to hear the silence. And in that silence, he heard footsteps, not outside, inside the walls. The next night, he returned with a hammer and chisel. Behind the paneling of the old confessional, he found a crawl space, thin, jagged, lined with candle stubs and scraps of paper, all with the same words, "Forgive me, Father, for I lied." And at the end, a mirror. Facing into the booth, someone had been watching every confession for years, taking notes, choosing victims. By morning, Samuel had returned. He was found at the foot of the bell tower, barefoot, eyes blank, clutching a rosary made of thorns. He couldn't speak, but inside his jacket was a torn page from the missing journal, written in Father Mallory's hand. Only one man knew all the names. Only one man heard every secret. He kept a list, and now the list is missing. That night, Father Brown entered the tower. The wind howled louder than ever before, but he kept climbing. Near the top, wedged behind the stone, was a single envelope. Inside, a photograph. 5 altar boys, smiling. 4 were now dead. The 5th was Father Mallory, and scribbled on the back, he was the first to lie. Father Brown stared at the note, heart pounding, wind shrieking through the bells above. And at that moment, something inside him broke, because the face he saw behind the camera was his own. He had taken that photo. He had been there. He had forgotten. And suddenly, the last words of Father Mallory's final confession came rushing back to him. "I've kept it from you all these years, but I had to. You don't remember what you did." The bell rang, louder than thunder, and Father Brown dropped the photograph. Because now he knew. The killer wasn't someone else. It had always been someone close. So close, in fact, they had shared a secret once. A secret buried so deep. Even he had tried to forget it. He whispered to the empty tower, "I know who did it." But the truth will never be told. Because some confessions were never meant to be heard. Chapter 4. Murderer. Waited inside the church. The choir sang over the body before they even knew it was dead. At first, no one noticed the slumped figure in the third pew. The old man in the wool coat, head bowed, hands folded as if in reverence. It was evensong, the candles flickering against the stained glass, the incense thick like fog curling around the rafters. The music rose in perfect harmony. Sanctus, Sanctus, and still, he didn't move. Not when the bells rang. Not when the priest passed by him holding the thurible. Not when a child dropped a hymn book with a loud crash against the flagstone. Because by then, he had already been dead for over an hour. It was only when the final verse faded and the candles were snuffed that a sacristan named Joan approached him, smiling politely. "Sir, the service has ended." She touched his shoulder and screamed. His skin was ice, his lips tinged blue, and in his lap, folded neatly between his fingers, was a single torn page from the confessional journal that disappeared the week before. On it, in red ink that bled across the parchment like veins, "He will kill again. And no one will stop him because he waits inside the church." The words were haunting, the implications worse. Father Brown stood over the body that night with a stillness that unsettled even the most hardened constables. He said nothing as the coroner examined the corpse. No wounds, no bruising, no sign of poisoning, just death, cold, sudden, and silent, which meant one thing. He had died in the presence of the sacred, and no one had noticed. Father Brown didn't sleep that night. He walked the perimeter of St. Mary's again and again, lanterns swinging in one hand, rosary clutched in the other. The wind howled through the ancient trees outside the chapel walls. Inside, it was colder. too cold, as though something had been hiding in the stone, listening, waiting. The victim was identified the next morning. Henry Tolliver, 78, former police archivist, retired, lived alone, quiet, harmless, but in his youth, he was one of the first officers assigned to the Carlisle murders. He helped gather the testimonies, the files, he signed the warrant, and now he was dead in the third pew, holding the journal page that never should have existed, which meant only one thing. The file on Carlisle had been reopened, but by whom? And why now? Father Brown began asking questions. Quietly, carefully. Henry Tolliver had no living relatives, no will. But his house was filled with files, dozens of old cases. But only one file cabinet had been recently opened, and the folder inside was marked Carlisle, Addendum, unverified. Inside, one sheet. There was a seventh girl. No name, no photo, just a date. March 3rd, 1952. And written beneath in handwriting, not Tolliver's, she was never found. That same night, someone broke into the church. They didn't steal money or silver or sacred vessels. They took the bell rope, just the rope. Father Brown stood beneath the empty bell tower at dawn, staring up into the hollow space where sound used to ring across the village like a heartbeat. The silence was deafening, the absence intentional. He turned back toward the pews and saw it, carved deep into the wood of the third pew where Henry had died. A single word. Witness. He ran his fingers along it slowly. The letters were jagged, rushed, but not random. Someone was watching. Someone wanted it known that they had always been watching. The next day, the church secretary, Mrs. Glade, collapsed in the rectory garden, her eyes wide open, mouth agape, heart stopped, no signs of trauma, no noise before it happened, just fell, gone. And beside her, beneath her apron, a photograph. 5 girls, smiling. A 6th, blurred in the background, face turned. Date, stamped, March, 1952. The same date as the missing girl. Father Brown examined it carefully. The faces were familiar. 3 had been named in the Carlisle case. 1 had vanished. 1 had lived but disappeared into obscurity. And the 6th, the one in the background, he had seen her before, in a painting. The painting that hung in the sacristy, untouched for years. He rushed to the church. The sacristy was open. The painting was gone. In its place, on the nail, hung a piece of cloth soaked in what looked like oil, or something far darker. And pinned to it, the broken tip of a chalice knife, wrapped in a ribbon. The ribbon was stained with blood, and embroidered on it, in delicate cursive, to Sister Madeline, with love. Sister Madeline had died 30 years ago, a nun who served during Carlisle's tenure. The official record said pneumonia, but an old whisper in the diocese claimed she was found at the altar steps, bleeding from the mouth, clutching a candle stub and a broken rosary. Her name had been erased from most records. Why? And who was the girl in the background? Father Brown took the ribbon and the knife to his study. He stared at them for hours. They weren't clues. They were provocations. Not from the killer. From someone who wanted the truth known, but in pieces. Like someone desperate to confess, but only if someone solved the puzzle first. He stared at the photograph again. The blur behind the girls. A shadow beside the altar. Not a girl. A man. Cloaked. Head bowed. And behind him, a second figure, looking into the camera. No face, but a collar, a priest's collar, which meant someone else had been there that day, someone not in the report, someone who had seen the seventh girl and buried the memory. That night, Father Brown locked himself in the confessional, not to hear sins, but to be heard. He spoke softly into the darkness. "I know you're still here." Nothing. Just the creak of the candle flame. Then, a whisper, so faint, he thought it was his own breath. "She's beneath the altar." He froze, waited. No one else in the church. He rushed to the altar, pried up the stone slab at the base, sealed since the 1800s. Dust, bone, fragments, and a rosary. Not just any rosary. It was Eleanor Cross's, the seventh girl. She had never left the church. They had buried her beneath the place she had tried to escape. And now, they were killing everyone who knew. Father Brown stood there, the stone open, the scent of old death rising around him, and felt a weight he had never felt before. Not just grief, not just horror, but complicity, because he had been there that night in 1952. As a young seminarian, he had heard the scream in the vestry and done nothing. He had been told it was confession pain, that sometimes the burden of sin made people wail. And so he had prayed while a girl died beneath the altar. He stood above her and prayed. Now the murderer wasn't hiding. He was waiting. Inside the church. He had been there the whole time, and he wasn't finished, because beneath the torn photograph, under the ribbon, was another note. Not blood, this time. Ink. Blue. Delicate handwriting. "You forgot the 8th. There was an 8th, but the files only mentioned 7. Unless the 8th wasn't a girl. The 8th was a witness, a priest, and only one man had been at all the original services, all the funerals, all the absolutions. Father Mallory, who was already dead, unless he wasn't, because when Father Brown opened the mortuary ledger, something snapped inside him. There was no death certificate, no body witnessed by coroner, no burial recorded, just a name written in the priest's own hand, signed as Mallory, as if someone else had faked it, someone who knew everything. He closed the book, hand shaking, and for the first time, he said it aloud. "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told, because he's still here, still kneeling in the pew, still waiting inside the church. And next time, he won't wait alone." Chapter 5. The candle that revealed everything. The flame shouldn't have burned blue, but it did, and it lit the face of a killer Father Brown buried 20 years ago. It was just a candle, one of hundreds kept in the sacristy drawer, dusty and unused, wax cracked with age. It was chosen at random, lit for the Vespers service after the usual stock ran low. But the moment Father Brown struck the match, something shifted. The wick hissed, the flame curled unnaturally, and for a fraction of a second, the entire church filled with the scent of scorched parchment and cold iron. Then, as the flame steadied, it flickered against the stained glass, projecting a shadow that did not match the room's interior. It was a silhouette of a man, head bowed, holding something in his hands, and in the very next blink, the shadow was gone. That was the beginning. Father Brown stood still, staring into the tiny blue flame that danced without wind. A simple candle had turned the entire nave into something unholy. No one else noticed it. The altar boys saw nothing. The parishioners knelt in prayer. But Father Brown, he saw the truth, or at least the corner of it, because this wasn't an ordinary candle. It wasn't meant to bring light. It was meant to reveal. After the service, he took the candle back to the rectory. He examined it carefully, scraping the wax, testing the wick, sniffing the remnants of the smoke. And there, buried at its base, he found it, rolled tight, tucked inside the hollow cavity of the candle's base. A strip of old brittle vellum, ink faded with time, but still legible. When the candle burns blue, the liar's face shall shine. A riddle, a warning, or something far darker. The next morning, Father Brown brought the candle to the crypt. He lit it again, in the darkness beneath the altar, watching the shadows twist across the ancient stone. He expected the same silhouette, but what he saw, he would never forget. The flame bent sideways as if pulled, and on the far wall, in trembling light, the shape of a door began to emerge, etched faintly in the stone, invisible under normal light. Carved into the surface was a symbol, a serpent wrapped around a chalice, a symbol banned by the church for nearly a century, the mark of the Order of the Broken Vow, a secret society of priests who believed that true salvation could only come through confession, extracted by force if necessary. The door was sealed, but the candle flame leaned toward it, twitching, eager. Father Brown pressed the stone. It gave slightly, groaned, then opened. Behind it was a hidden passage, narrow, ancient, slick with mildew and memory. He descended without a word, heart pounding, the candle barely holding flame. And at the end of the passage, a chamber, circular, 6 chairs, all facing inward, each one engraved with a name. All men of the cloth, all presumed dead. But one name was familiar. Mallory, not Father Mallory, Brother Mallory, a name from decades past, a novice who disappeared in 1952, not ordained, not buried, erased. Suddenly, Father Brown understood. Father Mallory was never real. He was a replacement, an identity assumed. But by whom? That night, the candle was lit again, this time during adoration. The flame burned steady until a woman named Hilda Weaver entered the chapel. As she knelt, the candle flared, blue, then violet, then back to yellow. And in that moment, the flame projected her face, clear as day, against the stained glass wall, except the face that appeared wasn't hers. It was Margaret Donnelly, the woman who died in Chapter 1. The woman who, by all records, had been buried 6 weeks ago. But the face was exact, identical, down to the scar under the eye. The flame flickered again. The projection vanished. Hilda's expression never changed. She knelt. She prayed. She left. But Father Brown's world was shaken. Because if Margaret was alive, then who died in the vestry? And more importantly, who had assumed her identity before her? He confronted Hilda the next day. She smiled, said nothing, but slipped him a folded page from the Book of Lamentations. And beneath the verse, scrawled in pencil, "The candle sees what eyes forget." That night, Father Brown couldn't sleep. He lit the candle once more, placing it before the mirror in the confessional. The flame pulsed, and in the glass, a figure appeared. Not his own, a priest, eyes hollow, mouth sewn shut, hands bleeding, and behind him, a girl, the same girl from the photograph in Chapter 4, the 7th, Eleanor Cross. Her eyes stared into his. She raised a hand, pointed toward the floor. and vanished. Father Brown dropped to his knees. He ripped back the floorboards beneath the confessional, and there, beneath rotted wood and dusted ash, he found it. A tin box. Inside, bones, small, fragile, and a note. She confessed, but no one listened. Eleanor had been killed inside the confessional, buried beneath it, hidden in the most sacred space of the church, which meant whoever killed her wasn't just a murderer. They were a priest, and one who knew how to make people forget. The candle burned low, but one last thing remained, a final test. Father Brown placed the candle in the choir loft, lit it, and waited. One by one, the villagers entered for Sunday Mass. He watched their faces. The flame flickered yellow, orange, then blue. When the bishop entered, blue again. When Hilda Weaver returned. But when the new priest arrived, Father Llewellyn, transferred only weeks ago, the candle went dark. No flicker, no color, nothing, just dead. As if it refused to burn. Father Brown stepped forward. No candle fails unless smothered, he whispered. He lifted it again, lit it by hand, but as soon as it flared, the church doors slammed shut, windows shattered, the bell rang, no one pulled the rope, and the candle burned a deep, violent red. The projection on the wall was not a face. It was a sigil, a mark older than the church itself, a serpent eating its own tail. Father Brown turned. Everyone in the pews was frozen, eyes wide, mouths shut, not breathing, not blinking, except one. Father Llewellyn, smiling, and in his hand, a second candle, identical, unlit. He stepped forward, calm, precise, and whispered, "Not all truth sets us free, Father. Some binds us, some burns." He placed the candle at the foot of the altar and left. The moment he was gone, everyone gasped, as though waking from a shared nightmare. They had seen nothing, heard nothing, but Father Brown had seen everything. And when he returned to the vestry, he found the original candle, melted into a pool of dark wax, hardened into a strange spiral. Embedded in it, a tooth, human, filed, and engraved with a single number, 8, the 8th girl, the final witness, still alive, still out there, or worse, still inside the church. That night, Father Brown didn't sleep. He whispered aloud in the empty nave, "I know who did it. But the truth will never be told. Because sometimes the light doesn't show the path to salvation. Sometimes it shows the face of the one standing behind you." Chapter 6. Whispers echoed through the confessional. The voice that whispered through the confessional was not human, and it knew Father Brown's sins better than he did. It was past midnight, long after the last candle had gone out. The nave was drowned in silence, the shadows swollen and twitching along the stone arches. Father Brown sat alone inside the confessional, trying to pray, though even prayer now felt like reaching through smoke. The murders, the missing, the faces, flickering in candlelight, each mystery stacked upon the next, like gravestones with no names. But when he heard the whisper, he froze. Not because it was unexpected, but because it said his name. Not Father, not Brown, just the name he hadn't heard in 40 years. Emrys. The voice slipped through the grill like breath over ice, and with it came something worse than fear. Recognition. No one knew that name. No one alive. He didn't speak, didn't move, but his pulse thundered beneath his skin. The whisper returned. "You were there when the 8th girl died." He felt his hands tremble. He had never told anyone that, never written it down, buried it under rituals, robes, and decades of quiet service. But now it was being summoned like a ghost. "I watched you pray," the voice continued. "You knelt while she begged. You knew something was wrong, but you looked away." A hot, metallic scent filled the air, like blood warming against the stone. "Who are you?" he finally asked. The answer came in laughter, dry, withered, like someone laughing underwater. And then, silence. When he opened the curtain, the other side of the confessional was empty, but the seat was warm, and on the floor, a single item had been left behind. A cassock pin, blackened with age, and engraved on the back, "Order of the Broken Vow," the very same secret society that had vanished from church records decades earlier, the same name, linked to the blue candle, the buried girl, the forged identities, and now the whispers in the confessional. Father Brown turned the pin over in his hand. It had been used recently, the edge still sharp. Someone had worn it, and they had been in his church, listening, knowing. That morning he spoke to no one. He said no mass. He lit no candles. He sat in the sacristy, staring at the pin, then finally opened the locked drawer he hadn't touched in years. Inside, a single book, bound in black leather, the unofficial record of confessions never written in church annals, a journal of sins so dangerous, so damning, the church refused to keep them. Father Brown had started it when he first heard a dying soldier whisper, "The devil wears robes." He turned to a bookmarked page, 1952 March, a girl, anonymous, confession recorded, "He says I'm holy when I bleed, but I don't want to be a saint." She had vanished the next day. The entry was the last one before the pages turned blank, not because there were no more confessions, but because Father Brown had stopped recording them, out of fear, out of shame, because the next voice he heard, after hers, belonged to a priest who confessed to nothing, only this: "I do not sin, I purify." The next day, 2 candles were found burned into the floor of the nave, melted entirely, leaving behind twin black pools in the shape of eyes. Directly between them, a third cassock pin, newer, sharper. The killer had been there again, but not to kill, to listen, to confess. Father Brown finally decided to act. He announced public confessions would resume that evening, midnight only, by appointment, just 1 slot. The killer took the bait. That night, Father Brown sat once again inside the booth, candle burning low, the grill casting spiderweb shadows across the wall. He waited, hands folded, eyes closed. Then a footstep. The curtain on the other side shifted. The air changed, and the whisper returned. "I have killed with the rosary and buried sins beneath prayer." Father Brown stayed silent. "I was there when Eleanor died, still silent. She begged for the name of God, but I gave her the name of death." The voice was deeper this time, confident, but laced with something else. Need. The need to be heard. He realized then, this was no ordinary killer. This was a man trying to be judged. "I killed Father Mallory too," the voice said. "He found the list. He tried to warn you, but he was too late. The list of children, of victims, of confessions weaponized." Father Brown felt bile rise in his throat. Then the voice changed, softened. "You think you're better than me, Emrys. But you listened, and you did nothing. That makes you mine." He lunged toward the grill, but Father Brown was faster. He flung open the curtain and stepped out. No one was there, only a whisper, still hanging in the air. "I'll confess again. Soon." Father Brown collapsed to his knees. He finally understood. The killer wasn't hiding. He was living inside the ritual, inside the silence, inside the confessional, feeding off the belief that secrets made people holy. He lit the blue candle again. This time, it didn't burn blue. It turned black, and the flame danced sideways, pointing toward the statue of St. Jude, the patron saint of lost causes. He stepped toward it, inspected the base, and found what he feared most: a hatch. Behind it, a box. Inside the box, a human jaw, still with a gold molar marked X. The eighth girl, or what remained of her. He called no police. He rang no bells. He lit a single candle, in the dark, and waited. He knew the killer would return. They always did. And when the footsteps came, he didn't flinch. The voice whispered again, "Forgive me, Father, for I have not finished." Father Brown looked into the dark and whispered back, "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told, because some sins are still confessing themselves." Chapter 7. Buried Secrets Beneath Church Floorboards. When the floorboards beneath the altar began to bleed, Father Brown knew it wasn't the first time the church tried to hide a body. It happened during a storm. Rain lashed against the stained glass, thunder rumbling like something ancient awakening beneath the stones. The congregation had gone home early, unsettled by the unnatural flickering of the sanctuary candles, every flame sputtering the moment the gospel was read aloud. Only Father Brown remained, walking the nave slowly, reciting prayers that no longer felt like absolution, but like warnings. That's when he noticed it, a dark streak creeping out from between the old oak planks beneath the altar rail. Not water, not oil, but blood, thick, blackened, old, and warm. He dropped to his knees and touched the seam of the boards. The blood was real, but the trail, barely visible, led west, toward the choir stalls, then vanished into the grain. He had seen it once before, decades ago. A girl had gone missing during midnight mass. They said she'd run away. They lied. She had screamed. Once, softly, almost a whisper, smothered by the hymn. No one believed it. He had. And now the church itself was bleeding with guilt. Father Brown moved quickly. He fetched a crowbar from the sacristy, returned to the nave, and pried the floorboards loose. The groan of wood echoed like a confession. Dust erupted, mold clung to the beam, and then silence, until the crowbar hit something hollow. A box? No, a coffin, unmarked, buried beneath the church, sealed in rotting velvet. He opened it and found not one body, but 3, all children, each with hands folded over their chests, rosaries bound tight around their wrists as if to keep them from rising. Their mouths were sewn shut, and their eyes were missing. Father Brown staggered back, dropped the candle. The light sputtered. Shadows trembled inside the coffin. Something else, a scroll, wrapped in blood-stained ribbon. He unrolled it with shaking hands. Not paper, skin, and carved into it were words. The 8th was not the last. The silence is a door. He vomited in the aisle. The coffins were real, the children untouched by time, hidden away like sins no one dared name. He recognized one face, despite the decades, Margaret Donnelly's missing younger sister, presumed drowned. She hadn't drowned. She had been buried alive beneath holy ground. That night, the bishop arrived. Not summoned, not informed, just arrived. He claimed he had received a feeling, a tremor in his dreams. Father Brown said nothing of the coffins. Instead, he watched the bishop closely. He remembered the man's face from an old photo. 1952. Seminary choir, standing beside Father Mallory. The bishop placed his hand on Father Brown's shoulder and whispered, "The church survives because it forgets what it must," then handed him a folded card. It read, "I warned you in the confessional." Father Brown's blood turned cold. It had been him. The whisper, the voice, the man who had confessed that night and vanished before he could be seen. He had returned, and now he was watching again. That evening the choir gathered to rehearse. Children, innocent, voices rising like birds into the rafters. Father Brown stared at the floor beneath them and imagined the silence of the dead pressing upward through the cracks. He lit the blue candle again. It burned straight, steady, until one note struck off-key. The youngest boy, Thomas, sang a single word wrong, and the candle flared, blue to white, then out. Father Brown stopped the choir, asked them to leave, but Thomas stayed behind and slipped a note into Father Brown's hand before vanishing through the side door. The note read, "He told me to sing wrong. So you'd know." The boy had been coached. Someone was communicating through him, and not just him. The next morning, each pew in the church had a name scratched into its side. Names of those presumed dead. 7 girls, 1 boy, and beneath them all, a final name. Emrys. His own. The whisper knew everything, knew what he had seen, knew what he had chosen to forget, knew that he, too, had walked that corridor below the altar once, long ago, and stepped over something soft. The scroll had said, "The silence is a door," and now it had opened. The confessional whispered again. Not once, not twice, but all night. He recorded it, listened back, static, until the 11th minute. Then, softly, "I'm still here. I'm in the floor." Father Brown returned to the altar with a lantern, removed more boards, dug deeper, and found stone, scratched with fingernails. Dozens of markings, tally marks, carved into the stone by someone trapped beneath it. One set of scratches had been gouged over and over violently until the entire stone cracked. He lifted the slab, and inside, nothing, just darkness, endless, and at the bottom, far below, a single candle burned blue. He dropped the lantern. It didn't hit the bottom. No sound. Nothing. He whispered down the hole, "I know who did it." His voice echoed back, but not in his own voice, in hers. The 8th girl, Eleanor, or perhaps the 9th, or the 10th. He no longer knew how many had died, how many had whispered their last words into that confessional, how many secrets had been buried beneath his feet while he stood above preaching salvation. The church was built on silence, but the floor was breaking. He stood over the hole, staring into the abyss that stared back, and said what he had refused to say for decades. "I heard her. I did nothing." And the whisper returned, "Now you must hear them all." The hole widened. The candle blew out. The church bells rang at midnight, and no one had pulled the rope. Just a voice carried on the wind, through the nave, past the pulpit, through the whispering dark. "I know who did it, but the The truth will never be told, because the dead beneath the floorboards were no longer silent, and they were listening now. Chapter 8. The Last Sermon Before Death. The congregation applauded when Father Brown finished his sermon, unaware that the man speaking from the pulpit was already dead. It wasn't his voice. It wasn't even his writing. The sermon had been left on the lectern before dawn, neatly typed, each page stamped with the seal of the diocese. But the seal was outdated, retired in 1949, and the content, it was blasphemous in its elegance. A perfect sermon, flawless in theology, but laced with something beneath the words. A hidden rhythm, a buried code, a message. Father Brown had read it aloud only because he felt compelled to, not forced, but pulled. As though something had reached up from beneath the church floor, gripped his soul, and whispered, "Read. Let them hear it. They must know." After the final blessing, no one noticed his trembling hands. No one saw the small trickle of blood behind his ear. No one questioned why his eyes were fixed not on the crucifix, but on the bell tower where a single figure stood, silhouetted against the storm outside. Not moving, not blinking, watching. It had started 2 nights earlier, when Father Brown found a letter slipped into his missal, one that hadn't been there when he locked the church. It was addressed simply to the one who stayed silent. Inside were only 4 words: "You preach, I will judge." No signature, no date, just that. And beneath those words, pressed into the paper, a bloody thumbprint. That night, the bells rang on their own, at 3 a.m., the hour of silence. Father Brown climbed the tower alone, lantern in hand, rosary clenched so tight it cut into his fingers. The bells hung motionless. No wind, no birds, just cold air and one sound. Breathing. Slow. Steady. Not his own. He turned. No one there. Just a candle stub. Still warm. And beneath it, carved into the wood, another phrase: "Preach like it's your last." He didn't sleep after that. He wrote nothing, prepared nothing, but the sermon still appeared, typed, bound, waiting for him. He didn't recognize the words, but he recognized the rhythm, because decades ago, at the seminary, one of the brothers used to write like that. Benedict Carlyle, the defrocked priest, the killer, the confessor who bled people to purify their faith, the man who whispered that salvation was pain and that some prayers were answered only when screamed, the man who vanished into fire, or so they thought. The handwriting was long gone, but the cadence remained, and now it was back in Father Brown's hands. He knew then the sermon was bait, but not for the congregation, for him. So he delivered it, every word. And when the church emptied, when the candles were out, he returned to the pulpit and opened the lectern drawer. Inside, a cassette recorder, still running. He pressed stop, rewound, and played. It wasn't his voice, not even close. It was Carlyle's, preaching, through him, possessing him. The words he had spoken were not his own, but Carlyle's final sermon, recorded decades ago on the night the orphanage burned. And suddenly, Father Brown knew what was happening. This wasn't a return. It was a resurrection, a ritual. And he had been the vessel. He played the tape again. Listen to the last few words. The blood of the forgotten cries, louder than the voices of saints. "You killed me, once, Emrys, but now you will hear me." Carlyle hadn't died in the fire. He had transferred himself into the ritual, into the liturgy, into the very words spoken from the altar. And now, he was coming back. Each sermon, each chant, each prayer. They were invocations, summonings. The more Father Brown spoke them, the stronger the voice became. And that meant one terrible thing. Someone had planted these sermons weeks ago. Someone had copied Carlyle's old homilies, rewritten them, dressed them in scripture, and left them like landmines in the heart of the church. But who? He returned to the rectory, tore through old boxes, hunting for Carlyle's writings, documents once locked away, buried in files too cursed to keep, and in a folder labeled Restricted B.C. 1953, he found a sermon titled Lamentations in Flame. It matched the one he had read, word for word, but at the bottom, scribbled in blood, "The last sermon shall open the door." The door to what? Not the crypt, not the altar, something deeper, something buried beneath memory. Father Brown remembered a story, whispered during his ordination, about a room hidden beneath the foundation of St. Mary's, a chamber sealed during the plague, said to house the bones of martyrs too dangerous to honor. The locus sanguinis, the place of blood. Legend said it could only be opened by a priest, giving their last sermon, which meant someone wanted Father Brown to open it, to finish what Carlyle had started. He lit the blue candle again, but this time it didn't flicker. It melted straight down the side of the pulpit onto the floor, dripping wax that sizzled as it hit the wood, shaping letters. A single word. Yes. That night, he preached again. Empty church. No one listening, except one figure in the back pew, cloaked, still, face hidden. But when he finished, the figure rose and placed a key on the altar, then left without a word. Father Brown stared at the key. It was carved from bone and shaped like a cross. He knew what it opened. The locus sanguinis. Beneath the pulpit, below the sanctuary, buried beneath guilt. He descended alone, lantern flickering, key in hand. He found the hatch, hidden beneath a mosaic. It opened with a hiss. The air, ancient. Inside, a chamber of whispers, walls lined with names, etched in blood, each name of a priest who had preached Carlyle's words. And, at the far end, a pulpit, stone, black, with a body slumped over it, still in vestments, still rotting, the mouth sewn shut, and in its hands, a sermon. One last page, he took it, read it, and felt the air shift, the ground tremble, the bells ring, above, without rope, without wind, and in his mind, one voice. I am the sermon, and now you are the church. Father Brown dropped the page, lit the candle, watched it turn black, and whispered, I know who did it. But the truth will never be told. Because some sermons aren't written to save. They're written to summon. And this was the last. Chapter 9. Death arrived during morning mass. The moment the chalice touched her lips, blood poured from her eyes like tears from a weeping statue. It was the feast of the Immaculate Heart. The nave bathed in golden morning light, incense thick in the air, the choir humming softly in Latin. The villagers filled the pews, their faces worn but faithful, their hands folded in reverence. At the altar, Father Brown lifted the host. The sacred moment of transubstantiation hung in the air like a held breath. And just as the first communicant stepped forward, an elderly woman named Agnes Morley, devout and sweet, who hadn't missed a single mass in 60 years. Everything went silent. She took the wafer. She drank from the chalice, and her body collapsed. She didn't fall gently. She convulsed, arms snapping backward, mouth opening in a scream that never came. Her eyes poured red, not from the corners, but from the center, thick, slow streams of blood that stained her cheeks as she collapsed to the stone floor beneath the altar. For a full 3 seconds, no one moved. Then someone screamed. Panic erupted. The service shattered. The choir stopped, mid-hymn. The organ hissed and fell silent. The bells above rang once on their own, a single hollow note, and then everything stopped. Father Brown dropped to her side. No pulse. Her hands were locked tight around the chalice stem, and inside, the wine remained untouched, unpoisoned. No smell, no trace. But something was wrong. Her tongue had been cut, not torn, not bitten, surgically removed. She had never screamed because she couldn't, not anymore. Someone had silenced her, just moments before communion, and the chalice had been in Father Brown's hands. The constables arrived within the hour. They questioned the altar boys, the choir, the sacristan. No one had seen anything. No one had touched the wine. No one had approached Agnes before the ceremony, except one person, Father Llewellyn. The new priest, transferred in quietly, records sealed, history unknown. He had offered to prepare the altar that morning, said he felt a calling. Now that calling was bleeding out across the sanctuary floor. Father Brown returned to the sacristy alone. The vestments were scattered. The wine was locked, but the key had been moved. Only slightly, only a priest would notice. And in the sink, hidden beneath a blood-stained linen towel, he found something that made his stomach twist. A tongue, wrapped in white cloth, still warm, still fresh. Father Brown dropped it, looked up, and saw it. On the mirror above the sink, written in fog, as if by invisible breath. She remembered. Agnes had known something. She had remembered something. And someone had removed the part of her that could tell it. Later that day, Father Brown opened her parish file. It was thin, too thin. Baptized at St. Jude's orphanage, the same orphanage where the first child vanished, the same orphanage where Benedict Carlyle once served. And buried deep inside the folder, between the baptismal certificate and a photo, was a scrap of old parchment, torn from a liturgical book. On the back, a single handwritten line. He made us drink it, said it was the blood of saints. Agnes had kept it for 60 years, hidden, until the day of her death. Father Brown stared at the chalice. It had come from St. Jude's. He remembered the engravings. A serpent, a flame, a chalice with eyes. The same image from the scroll, found in the Locus Sanguinis. The same order, the same ritual. The order of the broken vow had returned. And now they were killing the witnesses, one by one. He remembered the voice in the confessional, the whisper, the threat, "I will judge." And now the judgment had begun. The next day, a boy went missing. Thomas, the choir boy who had slipped him the warning in chapter 7. His shoes were found beneath the altar, his robe folded, clean, and carved into the pew where he once sat. He listens when we sing. The choir was dismissed, the church locked. Father Brown barred the doors. But at midnight, the organ played itself. A single note, over and over, low, unbroken, the sea of death. He approached it slowly and found a note beneath the keys, typed, old, familiar. They drank, they saw, now they must forget. He lit the blue candle. The flame bent sideways. toward the bell tower. He climbed. Inside, where the bell hung above the village, he found Thomas, alive, bound, mouth sewn shut, eyes wide, and on his chest, carved into skin. He drank the real blood. Father Brown carried him down himself. No police, no ambulance, only silence. And that night he stood before the altar and poured the remaining wine into the fire. It hissed, flared blue, and turned to smoke. The chalice cracked, and inside its base he found a hidden compartment, a page, ragged, handwritten, not Carlyle's, Agnes's, a testimony. We were children. He said we were vessels. The wine was black, and it made the others quiet. I faked it. I spat it out. I never told, until now. Please forgive me. Please bury this. He wept, and then the bells rang. Not one. All three, simultaneously, without wind, without hands. He looked to the choir loft and saw them. 7 figures, in robes, silent, motionless, watching. Then they vanished. He was alone, but not really. The order was here, not a myth, not a memory. They had infiltrated again, through the sermons, through the wine, through the rituals themselves. They weren't ghosts. They were clergy, real, alive, and using the Mass to mark their victims. Father Brown stepped into the confessional that night and waited. Hours passed. Then a whisper, soft, sharp, familiar. "You're next, Emrys." He didn't answer, just whispered, "I know who did it." But the truth will never be told, because death had come during Mass, and it had taken communion. Now it waited for the priest. Chapter 10. He died holding the crucifix. His heart had already stopped when the congregation saw him raise the crucifix, and yet his lips kept moving. It was the moment just before the dismissal. Father Llewellyn stood at the altar, eyes closed, voice low, offering the final blessing over the faithful gathered below. But something felt wrong, off, not just in his tone, but in the rhythm of his speech, as if he wasn't delivering a blessing at all, but reciting something else, something older. His right hand trembled as he lifted the crucifix high into the air, and then just before the final amen, his eyes rolled back into his head. His body swayed, and then he collapsed to the floor. The crucifix struck the marble with a clang that echoed down the nave like a funeral bell. The congregation rushed forward, but by the time anyone reached him, Father Llewellyn's face was ashen, his body cold, and clutched in his rigid hands, gripped so tightly they had to be pried, open with force, was the very same crucifix that had hung on the sanctuary wall since 1871. No one knew how it had gotten into his hands. It had not been moved. No one had seen him touch it. And yet somehow it had become the last thing he ever held. And strangest of all, his lips were still moving when he was dead. No sound came from them, just movement, mouthing something no one could hear, except Father Brown, who had read those lips before, decades ago, in a forgotten confession. Lux tenebris intravit, the light has entered the darkness. The phrase was carved into the base of the crucifix, in Latin, a relic from the Inquisition, a cursed artifact, a remnant of a holy war. No one remembered, and everyone had tried to erase. And now it had returned to a man whose file had no birth record, no seminary listed, and whose priesthood had been approved by a bishop who had died 15 years before he was ordained. Father Brown stared at the body on the floor and didn't see a priest. He saw a puppet, a vessel, and worse, he saw the end of something ancient, breaking loose from behind stone. That night, he remained in the church after the body had been taken away. He placed the crucifix on the altar, relit the old blue candle, and waited. The flame flared violently, then died, then flared again. And behind him, the confessional creaked open. No one inside, just a sound, a faint clicking, like teeth tapping, and then a whisper, "You took the wrong one." Father Brown turned toward the voice, but there was no one there, only the echo, soft and certain, winding through the stone. "You think Llewellyn was me?" the voice hissed. "He was not. He was the key." Father Brown approached the pulpit, heart pounding, each step heavier than the last. Beneath the cushion, where Father Llewellyn had stood, a folded piece of parchment lay wedged into the crack of the wood. He pulled it out carefully. It was a page from the diary of Eleanor Cross, the 8th girl, still alive, or once alive. The handwriting shook. The words were smeared in places with what looked like wine, but smelled like blood. "They made us hold the crucifix during the rite. If we dropped it, they started over, and over, and over. He said the crucifix would keep our souls from leaving until they were ready to be judged." Father Brown stared at the crucifix now resting on the altar. He had seen it move once, on its own, in 1974, a mass during the winter, a child screaming, and a priest found kneeling beneath it, eyes burned out of his skull, clutching a missal open to Psalm 88. "You have put me in the lowest pit, in the darkest depths." It hadn't been reported, it had been buried, and now it was back. The crucifix was more than a symbol, it was a seal, a lock, and someone had forced it open. The next day, Father Brown returned to the rectory, waiting on his desk. Neatly placed was a funeral program, Father Llewellyn's, but the photo wasn't his face. It was Benedict Carlyle's. A younger version, yes, but unmistakable. A face etched in Father Brown's nightmares. The two men were the same. Or perhaps Carlyle had taken his face, worn it, spoken through it, delivered the last rites of something far older than death. Inside the program was a second folded note. 3 more before the reckoning. Do not stop the rites. Let them finish. If you interrupt again, the children will rise. He dropped the paper, went straight to the church, began tearing up the sanctuary floor with his bare hands. He knew where the bodies were. He had helped place them there. Or at least, he hadn't stopped it. He clawed through the rotted boards, stone beneath, scratched, cracked, and beneath the stone, nothing. A hole, a dark pit, and within it, eyes, dozens of eyes, staring up, open, alive, but never blinking. He fell backward. The pit sighed, a warm breath of death. Then the blue candle relit on its own, and he heard a voice behind him, familiar, beloved, his own mother's, calling his name, Emrys. He turned. No one. Just the crucifix, pulsing now, bleeding from the eyes. The body of Christ, weeping red, and at its base, another note. He died holding the crucifix, but he wasn't holding it for protection. He was holding it to keep the others from coming through. Father Brown backed away, stumbled into the first pew, collapsed, and the whisper returned. You should have let him finish. The lights in the church went out. The bells rang backwards, and the pit below glowed faintly blue. He knew then, Father Llewellyn's death was not the end of the ritual. It was the opening. And now the others could walk free. The confessions were never meant to be spoken. They were meant to be buried, because the truth doesn't set you free. It summons what waits underneath. And the crucifix? It was the gate, the seal, the prison, now broken. Father Brown whispered to the dark, "I know who did it. But the truth will never be told. Because the dead are no longer beneath the church. They are standing in the pews." Chapter 11. The widow lied to everyone. The night her husband was buried, the widow placed flowers on the wrong grave and smiled as if no one would notice. Father Brown did. She wore all black, as expected, but not mourning black. No veil, no tremble in her step, no handkerchief crushed between trembling fingers. Instead, she stood straight as a soldier, heels perfectly aligned, head high, and eyes fixed on a headstone that did not belong to the man in the casket, while the villagers bowed their heads at the grave of Gregory Hall, devoted husband, banker, philanthropist. The widow walked 15 feet to the left and gently set a bouquet of night-blooming jasmine down at the foot of an unmarked stone. She kissed the petals, then turned and whispered something to the dirt. That was the first lie. The second came during the eulogy. Father Brown had delivered it himself, short and somber, relying on the limited details anyone truly knew about Gregory. A private man, rarely seen at service, generous with donations, but never with time. But when the widow stood to speak, her voice soft and low, she began, reciting a memory that never happened. She spoke of their wedding day in Paris, of a fire that broke out in the chapel as they exchanged vows, of how Gregory carried her through the smoke as stained glass shattered behind them. It was a beautiful story. It was also impossible. Gregory Hall was deathly afraid of fire, and he had never left England. There were no records of international travel, no wedding certificate in France, no photographs, nothing, just the story, and that perfect smile. After the burial, as the villagers dispersed, Father Brown stood alone at the grave she had truly visited, the unmarked one, overgrown with moss. Beneath the roots of the ash tree, he brushed the leaves away and found only 3 initials carved into the stone, ERM. No date, no epitaph, only the faintest outline of a serpent curled around a chalice. His stomach turned. It was the mark of the Order of the Broken Vow. Again, he returned to the rectory and opened the oldest baptismal log he could find. 1931. The ink faded, some names nearly illegible, and there it was, Eleanor Rose Mallory, baptized March 3rd, a name he had seen scratched into a pew, a name whispered beneath the altar, a name marked for death. But Eleanor was supposed to be dead. She was the 8th girl, the body buried in silence, the confession hidden, unless the girl in the grave wasn't Eleanor, unless Eleanor had survived and changed her name and married and become someone else, someone like Mrs. Catherine Hall, the widow. That would explain her silence during the previous deaths, her absence from church, her refusal to confess. She wasn't avoiding God. She was hiding from her past. And now, her past had finally caught up. He visited her the next morning. She offered tea. Her hands were too still. Her house too quiet. The walls lined with books, none with titles, just blank spines. But the fireplace glowed with fresh ash. And on the mantel, a photograph, 2 girls, smiling, identical twins. One of them, unmistakably, Eleanor. He pointed to the other. She died, didn't she? The widow's smile faltered. Eleanor died in the fire, she whispered. I barely got out. Gregory found me. He saved me. But the ashes in the fireplace told a different story. Inside them, the charred remains of a photograph. The same picture. But this time, both girls were circled in red ink, and a word written beneath them. Confessor. Someone had marked them, hunted them, used them, then erased them. But one survived, the wrong one, or the right one, depending on whose story you believed. Father Brown asked to see Gregory's belongings. She declined. He insisted. She stood, crossed the room, unlocked a drawer, and inside, a box. Inside the box, a robe, black, frayed, stained with something dark, and folded within it. A journal, written in Gregory's hand, and on the first page, confession begins with silence, but ends with blood. Gregory Hall had been a priest. Not publicly, not canonically, but secretly, initiated into the order. His wife, his bride, was not just Eleanor. She was the last witness, and he had married her to keep her from speaking. Until now, the journal told everything: names, dates, rituals, and at the end, one final line: if she lies again, bury her where the girls are. Father Brown stepped back. The widow said nothing, only stared at him, calm, then whispered, "You don't know who died that night." And he realized she was right, because if Eleanor had survived, who had died in her place? Who had been buried under the altar? Who had screamed behind the confessional? And most of all, who was the woman standing before him? She smiled again, picked up a candle, lit it. The flame turned blue, then red, then black, and she whispered, "You've been confessing to the wrong priest all along." The walls creaked, the windows shuddered, and beneath the floorboards, a knock, 3 taps, then silence. Father Brown left without another word, returned to the church, lit the sanctuary candle, and waited. But the whisper did not come. Only a voice, clear, from the pulpit, "You let her live." He turned, saw nothing, only the crucifix, now upside down, blood at its base, and on the altar, written in salt, "The widow lied to everyone." He whispered, "I know who did it. But the truth will never be told, because the lie wasn't just hers, it was the church's, and now the truth was waking up." Chapter 12. Father Brown saw the killer. He looked into the mirror behind the confessional and saw a face that should have been dead for 60 years. His own. It was not a hallucination, not a flicker of candlelight, not grief or madness or the burden of too many buried sins. It was him, younger, thinner, wearing the black collar, eyes like fire behind a veil of calm. And in the reflection, the figure raised its hand and pressed one blood-stained finger to its lips. Father Brown staggered back, knocking the candle from its holder. The flame extinguished instantly, plunging the church into a silence so profound it felt unnatural, like a tomb holding its breath. The mirror now only showed darkness. His reflection gone, erased. For weeks, the murders had escalated. Each death, more precise, more ritualistic, more impossible. People were no longer just dying. They were being turned into symbols. Every victim chosen like verses from a gospel rewritten by something that remembered God, but no longer feared him. Father Brown had resisted belief in the supernatural all his life. Every ghost had a motive, every demon a psychology. But now, as he stared into the space where his reflection had stood, he realized the horror wasn't that the killer might be someone else. It was that the killer might have always been inside him. The final page of the missing journal had been delivered hours earlier, left on the altar in a blank envelope, sealed, with wax in the shape of a broken cross. Inside, one line, "The killer walks with your feet." It was not metaphor, not poetry. It was fact. He went to the crypt, the deepest part, the part sealed before he was even born. The locus sanguinis, where they said the first martyr of the broken vow was buried alive with the names of those he swore to silence. The chamber had been locked, but now the door stood open. Inside, a circle of chairs, all facing a single pulpit. And on that pulpit, a photograph, old, dust-covered, faded, but clear enough, a seminary class, 20 young men, all smiling, except one, the boy in the back, not smiling, not posing, looking directly into the lens, and Father Brown recognized the face. It was his, not similar, exact, but the photograph was dated 1912, 40 years before he was born. He stumbled back. The floor creaked beneath his feet. A whisper echoed through the chamber. "Now you see me." The voice was behind him, but when he turned, there was no one. Just the wall, carved with names. Some he recognized, some already dead, some still alive. But one name was being carved as he watched. Fresh, wet, Emrys Brown. He fled, ran through the tunnel, into the sacristy, heart pounding, lungs tight. He tore off his collar, looked into the mirror again. This time, the face was there, not moving, not blinking, just watching and smiling. It mouthed the words, "You saw me at last." That night, Father Brown did not sleep. He searched every sermon he had ever written, every confession ever kept. He found patterns, phrases, recurring references. He had quoted the order before, without realizing it. He had used their doctrine in homilies, their symbols in penance, their chants in funeral rites. They had been inside him the entire time, and that meant something unspeakable. He hadn't been resisting the killer. He had been the passage, the host, the gate, and it had all started in the confession. The first voice he ever heard in the confessional had not been human. He remembered it now, the whisper on his ordination night, when the church was empty. And yet the grill spoke. "You will forget until it's time to remember." And now he remembered the murders, the blood, the sacrifices. They were not random. They were chapters. And he had written every one of them, unknowingly, faithfully, a perfect vessel. The candle had burned blue every time he approached the altar. He thought it was truth revealing itself. But it had been judgment. He walked through the nave barefoot, stripped of robes, and placed his hand on the confessional door. He stepped inside, sat, waited. The curtain on the other side shifted. A figure sat down, invisible behind the grill, but breathing. They spoke first. "You confess me," he answered. "Yes. You called me a killer." "You are." "No," the voice said, calm. "I am the witness. You are the one who did not stop me." Father Brown trembled. The blue candle reignited. Somewhere a bell rang. The voice continued, "I am the one who remembered. You are the one who chose to forget." A mirror slid open in the wall. He looked inside and saw the reflection. Not younger, not older, just him. Exactly as he was, but with blood on his collar. The reflection whispered, "I know who did." Father Brown's lips moved in unison. "But the truth will never be told." The bells began ringing in reverse. The pews groaned as if someone unseen had just filled every seat, and the crucifix on the altar turned upside down. Outside, the sky went dark, though the sun had not yet set, and inside the church, the killer stood, not outside, not in shadow, not wearing a mask, but in plain sight, clothed in cassock, rosary in hand, face familiar to every soul in the village, because he had heard all their sins, held all their secrets, and judged them righteously, with grace, with purpose, with silence. Father Brown stepped out of the confessional, walked to the altar, lit the final candle, and whispered what he had denied for a lifetime. I saw the killer. The church trembled. The air broke. The last bell rang, and the whisper answered, "Yes, and he saw you too."